we've talked about this before, but it's a point that kind of comes up pretty regularly. One, because of the way that I named my school, and which we'll get to in a minute. And two is, in my opinion, just a common misconception. So we have to ask ourselves, what is boxing? And most of you, well, if you've been around a while, you know what I'm going to say. But most of you who are, let's just call it in the normie side of martial arts, and that's, I'm not throwing shade, right? Everybody's at a different place on their journey. Everybody's at a different place in their understanding of history and culture and all of that. A lot of people aren't even interested in that stuff. I get it. But the language that we use matters. And look, some people will say, well, hey, what about the etymological fallacy of assuming that because a word once meant something, that's how we use it in common usage and blah, blah, blah. That fallacy really only applies if you're trying to mischaracterize somebody's argument based on etymology when you may know full well what they mean. Etymology still matters, right? And sometimes semantics matters a lot. Sometimes it doesn't, for sure. But sometimes semantics really matters a lot. And so let's say something for sure. I knew this going in when I named my school what I did, right? Black Sun Boxing. I needed something to put after the Black Sun, which is just a play on my name, right? Solomon Blake. Sol, right, is short for Solomon, but is also Latin for sun. Blake is ambiguous in origin. If it's Old English, which is one, it means black. And if it's French, it means white. We don't know. And because, rock and roll and metal, right, I went with black. So Black Sun, it's just my name. But, yeah, ego. But then I had to pick something else, right? And I specifically picked those two little characters that started off my journey in the martial arts. Describes what we call Chinese boxing and goes with my outlook on striking and especially traditional martial arts, and that includes traditional boxing pre-Queensberry rules. And that's why I went there with it. And those characters, you're going to see this on the screen. I had clipped these images prior, and so instead of writing on my whiteboard, I'm just going to load the images here for you. And what you're going to see is that not only is boxing just a well-recognized term for striking martial arts, but if we look historically at what boxing was prior to the Marquess of Queensberry rules, right? When we look at the London Prize Ring rules, when we look at Jack Broughton's rules, when we look at the pre-rules era, pre-rules, there's some kind of newer evidence, despite everybody saying the whole Jack Broughton thing, that rules and conventions kind of go back further, and that kind of makes some sense. I'm not ready to make a video on that yet. There's more research to be done, but it is an interesting topic. But what we're talking about here is the fact that during this era, and granted they are technically separate eras, but during this era of what we call boxing, the term was used to differentiate from wrestling or grappling, right? Wrestling was kind of the common term, at least in the English-speaking world. Grappling kind of comes about later. I mean, it's a French term. English don't like French, blah, blah, blah. But wrestling, right, meaning to twist, right? Wrestling was kind of like the baseline thing. Pretty much every culture has wrestling of some sort. It's true, grappling is probably a slightly more generic term and probably the more appropriate term for the umbrella of things that we would consider not striking martial arts. But because that was such a big thing, right, you wanted to call fighting that was striking oriented something else, right? The Greeks did this with was it Pygmachia or something like that? I'm probably pronouncing it completely wrong. I believe there was some Roman boxing. There was supposedly an Italian boxing. I don't know if it's a sport or culture or whatever that we don't know much about. But I mean, we're talking about stuff that happened like in the Middle Ages, post Rome. boxing has shown up in little bits and pieces, right? But mostly what we see when we look at some of these old HEMA manuscripts is it's all wrestling, right? Striking shows up here and there. We see punches and we see like dirty boxing, all the eye gouges and hair pulling and stuff like that. We see all that stuff, but it's still very oriented in that realm of, like think like Japanese martial arts. Like I'm grappling you and I'm using a strike, like an atemi strike, to enter into the grapple or to finish the grapple or whatever. And so when we start seeing boxing coming around, and we're probably looking at like the 1600s, as far as like the English emergence of boxing as like a subculture, a lot of it was, we're talking about like children in the streets settling the score, all this kind of stuff. And when we start looking at that, what are we seeing, right? We're still seeing grappling being involved. We're seeing stuff. Look, I made that video a little while ago about how old school boxing was kind of wild, right? And it talks about like hair pulling and crushing the windpipe and stuff like that, right? There was still a lot of grappling involved. But the idea of boxing, right? If the origin of that word holds true, that it's like of that Dutch origin, and it's an onomatopoeia for the sound of striking, right? It was there to distinguish striking from grappling. And it didn't mean grappling went away, just like there was some striking in the grappling. We're also talking about there's some grappling in the striking. It's just that the point or the main focus, the main course of boxing was the striking. And so we see that as it goes from this kind of loose local traditions, unspoken conventions, whatever you have, into the rules, Broughton's rules and prize ring rules, you start seeing like it's about striking. With it being English, right? It's all waist up, nothing below the waist, no grappling below the waist, and no striking below the waist. No striking a man when he's down, no grappling a man when he's down, all that kind of stuff. But you could freely hold the guy to hit him. You could throw him to the ground. That kind of stuff, right? There were no prohibitions against submissions. It may not have been a common tactic, but there was no prohibitions against like painful holds and twisting somebody up. You're really just looking for a man to bow out, right? To give up, to forfeit the match if you don't knock him out. Like that's all you're looking for. And so when we look at the tradition of boxing, it is really not that different from what we see in other traditional martial arts, or what we would call like the Asian traditional martial arts, largely being Kung Fu, karate, silat, that kind of stuff. Any of the striking oriented ones, we see that over and over and over again. Loads and loads of grappling supported striking. That is the foundation of where boxing comes from and what boxing is. And because of that, in England, when you have England coming into southern China and traveling around Asia, when they see Chinese fist fighting, what we call Kung Fu, one of the popular terms for that, right, is, in Mandarin it's Chuan Fa, and in Cantonese it's Kun Fat. I'm probably pronouncing this pretty poorly. Please forgive me. But you can translate that independently, right, as fist, right? Chuan and Kun, right, just Mandarin and Cantonese respectively, just means fist. It's literally character of the hand, which looks like the lines on a palm, and to be rolled up, right? It literally is just a description of a curled up hand or a fist. And then the fa is yes, it means law. A lot of Kempo people mistranslate this then as like law of the fist. That's not what it means. It also means like jurisdiction or method or practice in the sense of like the domain of something, right? And so basically saying, right, this is fist-oriented practice, otherwise known as, what do we call it? What did the English call it? Chinese boxing. Now, of course, the word Chinese isn't in there. The British used that modifier to call it Chinese boxing. And because the common term there literally means basically fist method, and that's the best literal translation of it. If you type that into Google Translate, which by the way is one of the worst translators, there are actually worse, but Reverso is kind of like the best as far as the freely available stuff online. By the way, you always want to look at stuff that's going to give you really solid breakdowns. There are some specific Chinese translators that I use too. Maybe on Substack, I'll throw those in so you can kind of start looking stuff up yourself. Really, really useful stuff. But anyway, if you type those two characters into, or copy paste, right? You probably don't have a Chinese keyboard to type them. If you put those two characters into Google Translate, it directly translates it just as boxing, which you're going to see right up here. However, if you translate it from Japanese, you go, well, why would I translate characters in Japanese? Well, because Japanese uses a lot of Chinese characters, but they read them differently. And when you read them in Japanese, they read as Kempo, which literally means the same thing. It doesn't change meaning, but in Japan, that's kind of the shorthand term for Chinese martial arts. And if you look at the, many of the old Okinawan schools of karate used the term Kempo. There are other Okinawan terms as well, which were actually probably more popular, but like Motobu Ryu really like used Kempo for sure. And there are others. There's Nippon Kempo. Well, Nippon Kempo is based off of Chinese martial arts. It has taken on its own characteristic in the decades that it's been around, but it comes from Chinese martial arts. You look at Shorinji Kempo, literally means like Shaolin boxing. And it is a Japanese take on Shaolin Kung Fu. So every time you see the word Kempo, it is referring to something of Chinese martial arts origin, which is a big reason you don't see it a ton because there's stress between those two cultures. But the point is that Kempo is just the Japanese version, and it's the shorthand for saying Kung Fu, the way that we say Kung Fu for all Chinese martial arts. And to be fair, I've heard from Chinese language speakers that at least in southern China, it's pretty common to hear people just call Kung Fu and mean martial arts as well. So even though Kung Fu is a very generic term, linguistically, it has come into shorthand use for martial arts. It just is what it is. That's how language works. The old definitions don't ever really get erased, but oftentimes common usage does end up taking over, right? And that's the tightrope that I'm walking with the name of my school, the name of my club being Black Sun Boxing. Is I understand that I'm going to have to explain this to people in the English-speaking world because they are not going to be able to read those Chinese characters, much less understand the nuance between traditional boxing, or i.e. striking-oriented martial arts, in the concept of the strike, hold, throw platform, which is what I consider traditional boxing styles, pre-20th century boxing styles are pretty much all that way. I'm sure you can find exceptions. There's always exceptions. But in essence, that is what boxing is. At least that's what boxing was, and that is the direction that I'm trying to take all of this, and the reason that I use the term. So while modern Western boxing, that is this probably billion-dollar competitive industry, and is an extremely valuable skill set, in fact, is the #1 striking art in mixed martial arts. It is extremely important to train modern boxing. But you have to bring it back into the context of the mixed martial arts platform, or the street fighting platform the traditional martial arts are built on. And in order to do that, you have to find ways to integrate it with grappling, to potentially integrate it with kicking. Not everybody is required to kick, obviously, but it is a useful skill, and it is a fairly common skill. So it's something that you at least have to be aware of, even if it's not something you personally specifically train. So long and short of it, right? That's what boxing is. That's what boxing was. And honestly, it's kind of what boxing is always going to be. Even in modern boxing, even though it's against the rules, technically against the rules, they still clinch up. the ABC Unified Rules actually read that you're not allowed to clinch, and yet they still get away with it. So, when you look at that, boxing still involves minimalist or support role grappling. So that's what we do, and that's what it means to us. And hopefully you start understanding or appreciating the fact that it is broader than the concept of just punching with the front of the fist above the waist. All right, guys, I'm going to leave you there, and I will talk to you later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.